Hello, everybody. Today I would like to discuss chess strategy. And of course, it's a very difficult topic. So it's going to be more about the basics, the bare basics, essentially, and some questions you can ask yourself to improve your strategic thinking and identify strategic goals. So, first off, what is chess strategy? What's the purpose of it? So, in my opinion, strategy is all about a semblance of control, whether it's controlling the king by checkmating, controlling the center to have more options for your pieces to move around or to attack, and also control as in winning material. If you win some of your opponent's pieces, you will naturally have more control over a position because you'll have more pieces that can control squares. So, because of this, we can look at these as strategic ends of a goal, essentially. And to start, we need to ask ourselves, how do we end up in those positions that are desirable? So, in order to do that, there are three main questions that are very popular. A lot of people discuss them at length, and they involve: what are the current weaknesses in a position? Also, we will have to discuss what weaknesses are. What is our worst place piece? And we are not talking about pawns in this case, we're talking directly about pieces. And lastly, what does our opponent want to do? So it would be not really good of me to just say these questions and not show examples for all three. So I thought it would be good to go down this list, start with the first one of what the current weaknesses are in a position, and yeah, we'll just use this checklist to look at a bunch of random positions and assess what our strategic goal may be. So now we're going to look at the first example, and we're going to do this while asking those three questions. So let's get past the opening, because I'm sure most of you will actually have an opening that you like to play already, but this is a good example. It's extremely symmetrical, looks really boring, but there's actually quite a bit still going on here, despite it being completely symmetrical. It might actually help us understand what our opponent's plans may be, because they probably should be the same plans as us, which helps. Here, what we can see is, if we go down the list, what are the weaknesses in the position? Well, there's only two real weaknesses that I see, and it's the e5 and the e4 square. If for some reason one side gets a piece to e5 or e4 and it can't be moved away, that could be annoying. That's a very active piece. You could also maybe say that both sides' kings could be potentially weak, right? Both bishops from both sides are directed at the king, so that is important as well. And because of that, the queen side is a little bit irrelevant. So we should develop our pieces and continue our play by making moves on the king side. Okay, so now that we know that we want to play on the king side, how do we develop our pieces? Of course, we want to bring our pieces to that king side, and that's going to help us quite a bit, actually. So let's go down now, after covering weaknesses, the other two questions, right? So the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what is my worst piece? And you might say the bishop or the knight. And you wouldn't be wrong, really, if you said either one. But you have to be fairly careful about which one you choose to develop. Both you can make good developing moves with, but I do think that there are some moves that are better than others here. For example, if you play the move knight to d2, which is a developing move, what's wrong with this? Right, so the bishop on c1 actually becomes a worse piece because it's actually blocked in by the knight. The knight on d2 is quite good, and it might even want to stay there, so maybe this isn't the correct option. Instead, bishop to g5, you could say, is better in retrospect, because after bishop to g5, let's say they play knight to d7, now we can play the move knight to d2, and there's no obstruction of the bishop on c1. However, their bishop is kind of stuck for the moment, so we might be able to claim that that's some sort of moral victory, and strategically, you look for those a lot. But okay, Now we're in this position where there's a slight imbalance, and let's keep asking these questions. So again, both sides might want to control these two squares, and there's a lot of ways to do that. Well, there's bringing the pieces further to the king side. For example, we might see a move like, well, bringing the knight, say, to g3. That would be a really good thing that you might see in the Ruy Lopez or the Italian. But it's quite hard to do that for the moment. There's also other ideas like, well, taking over the e-file. That's the only file that the rooks can actually go on. So that's also something to keep in mind as well. Here, I think the best plan is some sort of rook to e1, taking over the open file a little bit, and then bringing the knight over to g3. So let's start that plan, shall we? Rook to e8. Now, do you want to play rook e1 immediately, or do you want to play something else? Because you could play rook to e1, or you could wait as well. And I think that there are some arguments for both. I would actually say the move c3 here is quite reasonable. And the reason why I like this move c3 is because right now what we're trying to do is actually connect our rooks, so when we bring a rook to the e-file, we can recapture with another piece. This is a strategic way of thinking of what our worst piece is. Of course, if we play rook e1 in this position, let's just say they trade. For an example, they trade. Now what's our worst piece? We can clearly see it's our a1 rook. So, if we back up a bit, c3 to play queen c2, we can either play the rook to e1 and then recapture with the a rook, or even consider rook a to e1 immediately. So keeping these things in mind are also very important. We don't need to take over the file quite yet. Now, after knight to f8, let's ask the questions again. Weaknesses, it's going to be the same. Okay, what's our worst piece? Our worst piece is now the a1 rook. Okay, so what we could do is move our queen, for example, to c2, and then play the rook a to e1. I think that's totally fine to play. But we also have to ask what our opponent's ideas are. And when we're asking our opponent's ideas, it might be a little bit difficult because, well, hey, if we don't know what we're doing, why would we know what our opponents are doing? But if we follow those rules and then apply those same rules to our opponents, there's going to be some moves that pop into your mind. For example, weaknesses, same. What's their worst piece, though? Well, the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8. So where would they like to put their bishop on c8? What do you think the best square is for it? d7 is not quite active. They might want to put their queen there. Bishop to e6 is okay. Blocks the e-file, though, a little bit. I think the best move is going to be bishop to g4. So what we could do here is, instead of playing queen c2 and focusing on what we wanted to do, which is bring our last worst piece into the game, we can also try to make sure that their pieces stay a little bit worse than ours. And we can do this by playing this move h3. After the move h3, all of a sudden, what we're doing is we are preventing bishop to g4, which we can be quite happy about. Now, after h3, they have to come up with some other sort of development. And we can go on in this position and play out some sort of fake game that isn't really too relevant to the situation, but I wanted to show one of these hypersymmetrical positions because this is where a lot of players, especially at the start, when they're newer to the game, they go wrong quite a bit. And they do that because they try to play some sort of aggressive option that might not be something in the fundamentals. They might create weaknesses for themselves. They might not focus on what their worst pieces are, and it ends up landing them in trouble. For example, even though it's not really much of a big problem for black yet, we can see that that bishop on c8 is a little bit sad. It wishes it was already on g4 or, hey, even g6. It would be extremely happy to neutralize this bishop. But unfortunately, because of just a very small thing that they did, moving the knight first, they made their bishop worse, and, well, they have some consequences to deal with because of it. Okay, and now we have a very, very common position where our opponent has an isolated pawn, and that's pretty much the only imbalance. So let's break down strategically how we can try to claim any sort of advantage, if there's one to claim, but we'll get to that. And exactly how that we should go about doing it, because there are going to be moves in these types of positions that are better than others, and you can follow this strategic idea of thinking in order to come to those conclusions and find the right answers. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what are the weaknesses in this position? You might have already noticed, because I did say that our opponent has an isolated pawn. So that's extremely important. What is our worst place piece? Now, this one might surprise you a little bit. So you might think the rook on f8, the rook on a8, or maybe even the queen to connect the rooks. But there's actually also an argument for the knight, because the knight could fall victim to some sort of d5 in the future. It is quite reasonably placed. Of course, I think that rook to a to c8 is one of the most natural moves if you don't follow the final rule of the strategic way of thinking. But yeah, they're not all really bad moves at all, but it's hard to claim an advantage with any of them. The last thing is, what does our opponent want to do here? And I did mention what our opponent wants to do is play the move d5. The second they can play the move d5, let's say a6 is played, and they play the move d5, all of a sudden they get rid of their only weakness, and what we're left with is white having more activity. This is quite common in isolated pawn positions, and something you want to avoid if you can. So a6 is a huge waste of time. Same thing with the move rook to c8. Even though we're following the rule of what our worst place piece is, unfortunately, d5 is played, and they can trade off their weakness. So there's no weakness to speak of. So maybe rook a to c8 isn't really what we should play. It's a fine-ish move, but not quite accurate. Instead, what you might come to the conclusion of is we want to actually prevent d5 by putting a piece there. So what you might look at first is queen to d5, and this looks okay-ish until we see rook to c5 and notice that they're kicking us away from d5, and they might be able to just play it anyways, especially thanks to the bishop covering the rook on c5 here. So that's a bit of a problem. Now we're left with only one conclusion. We need to control d5 again, and we need to make sure that when we control it, we're controlling it with a piece that they really don't want to take. And that's where we'll end up with the move knight to e7, which is objectively going to be the best move in this position and is a very common move. It might be surprising because we're taking away an attacker of the d4 pawn, which is weak, but in reality, it's not really exploiting the weakness of the isolated pawn that's important. It's about making sure that the pawn can't be traded off, and so it can be attacked later. After the move knight to e7, what our idea is, let's just say the move a3 is played. After knight to d5, it is impossible, without white losing material here, to play the move d5 ever. And now we can follow our other strategic ideas, which is, for example, playing moves like queen to d7 and one of the rooks to c8, maybe trading some pieces along the c-file, and leaving them with this isolated pawn on d4 to attack later. So by asking these three questions, we may get different answers depending on what we ask, and that's why it's actually really important to ask all three. It might seem tedious to ask yourself this all the time, but, well, this is recommended especially for those that are trying to improve at longer time controls, because you should have time for these questions. So keep that in mind when you're playing. If you look at the first question, for example, what the weakness is, sometimes you can find something right away, whether it's a forced checkmate or, well, winning material also by force. If you can't, then maybe consider what your worst place piece is. For example, the rook on a8 isn't really doing anything, and same thing with the rook on f8. These can be improved. But also, what does our opponent want to do? And if you're not sure what your opponent wants to do, ask the questions again. That's the trick. So for example, our opponent will also notice that this is a weakness. Of course, all of their pieces are quite good, so I don't think they're worried too much of improving their pieces further. However, well, what do they want to do? They want to play d5. And for example, if we play a6 and we switch the board now, we have to ask these same questions, and we can quite easily. What are the current weaknesses? Of course, we might notice the d5 square, and we noticed as well that our opponent should have played knight e7 to d5 in order to prevent us from trading off this weak pawn. Our worst placed piece? Well, I guess we could increase the scope of our queen and our rook by pushing the pawn. So that gives us an answer. And also, of course, it gets rid of our weakness. So the weakness is in the position, which is our isolated pawn. That gets resolved. And also, it improves our pieces. So it's very logical to come to the conclusion of d5. And this is how we can retroactively think about this position as black. White wants to push d5. We want to prevent it. So to conclude, asking the three questions of what your or your opponent's weaknesses may be, what your worst piece may be, as well as what your opponents might want to do, can help you come to some conclusions about the position and, well, make play even if you are in completely unknown ground and the position doesn't resemble anything you've seen before. Because, well, we want to make sure that if we are approached with new positions or new ideas, we're not fish out of the water. Anyways, I hope you guys did enjoy this lesson. We will be continuing these ones starting next week. We will be continuing and talking about what weaknesses are and identifying a bunch of different types. Well, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you there. Bye-bye.